Margaret Whitman's shriek cut through the peaceful Saturday afternoon like a siren. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed accusingly at the Washington family's pool, where 3 children splashed and laughed. Those people do not have pool privileges. I'm the HOA president, and I did not approve their application. The words escaped her lips before she could consider their impact or, more importantly, who might hear them. Unfortunately for Margaret, 17 residents of Sunnyside Estates witnessed her outburst, including 4 board members and the pool maintenance man who was quietly recording the entire thing on his phone. Darius Washington, a successful cardiothoracic surgeon who had moved his family into the neighborhood just 3 weeks prior, slowly removed his sunglasses. "Excuse me." His voice remained remarkably calm. "We submitted our application and received approval 2 weeks ago. I have the email right here on my phone." Margaret's face flushed crimson beneath her wide-brimmed sun hat. She had specifically misplaced the Washington family's application, ensuring it would never reach the approval stage. Their Tudor-style home with its tasteful landscaping and luxury vehicles had been a thorn in her side since they moved in. The Washingtons represented everything the neighborhood aspired to be, and Margaret couldn't stand it. "The system must have malfunctioned," she said, attempting to regain composure. "There's a specific process, and I personally review all applications." Jennifer Rodriguez, the HOA treasurer, stepped forward. "Actually, Margaret, I approved their application myself after not hearing back from you. It's all documented in the system." A hush fell over the pool area. Margaret felt the weight of stares from her neighbors, people who had once cowered before her clipboard and citation pad. "Well," she sputtered, "there are still rules about noise levels and the number of guests allowed at the pool." Darius's wife, Sophia, a corporate attorney, joined her husband. "Our children and their cousin are well within the 5-person limit per household. Would you like to count them?" Margaret tightened her grip on her designer tote bag. "This isn't about. I'm simply enforcing the rules that everyone agreed to when they moved here." "Are you?" asked Darius. "Because it seems like you're enforcing rules selectively." The whispers among the onlookers grew louder. Margaret had spent 3 years building her authority in Sunnyside Estates, crafting a reputation for unyielding adherence to regulations she often created or modified to suit her preferences. As her carefully constructed facade began to crumble, Margaret made a snap decision. She would not back down. Not here. Not publicly. "I'll be bringing this up at the next board meeting," she announced loudly, "and reviewing all pool access protocols. Until then, consider yourselves on notice." As she turned to leave, her heel caught on a pool chair, sending her tumbling forward. Her tote bag flew open, spilling its contents across the concrete: citation pads, a folder labeled "Violations by Householdy," and a stack of rejection letters, including one with the Washington family's name clearly visible. The pool area fell silent as Margaret scrambled to collect her belongings, her cheeks burning with humiliation. This was only the beginning of her troubles, though she didn't know it yet. Margaret spent Sunday in self-imposed isolation, ignoring the buzzing neighborhood group chat and the 3 voicemails from Jennifer Rodriguez requesting an emergency board meeting. By Monday morning, her resolve had hardened. 24 hours of reflection had convinced her that she was the victim in this situation, a dedicated volunteer being undermined by newcomers who didn't appreciate her sacrifices for the community. She marched into Sunnyside Estates clubhouse for the hastily arranged 7 p.m. meeting with a 3-inch binder of HOA bylaws and a practice speech about community standards. The room, typically half empty during these meetings, was packed to capacity. Margaret spotted Darius and Sophia Washington seated in the front row, their expressions unreadable. "Before we begin the official meeting," Margaret announced, "I'd like to address Saturday's unfortunate misunderstanding." Jennifer Rodriguez cleared her throat. "Actually, Margaret, the board has agreed to a different agenda tonight. In light of recent events and evidence that has come to our attention, we'll be discussing HOA leadership." "Evidence? What evidence?" Margaret's voice rose an octave. The projector hummed to life, displaying a series of emails from Margaret's HOA account. In horrifying clarity, they showed her systematic blocking of the Washingtons' attempts to integrate into the community, their pool application marked hold indefinitely, their request to plant additional trees in their backyard mysteriously lost, their invitation to the summer block party conveniently misfiled. "These were accessed through the shared HOA email account," Jennifer explained. "There's more. We have testimony from 3 former residents who left Sunnyside specifically because of discriminatory treatment." Margaret's mouth opened and closed without sound. The room spun slightly as whispers rippled through the audience. "This is a witch hunt," she finally managed. "I've dedicated 3 years to keeping this neighborhood pristine. Property values have increased 12% under my leadership." "At what cost, Margaret?" asked Harold Bennett, a retired judge and board member. "The HOA exists to maintain community standards, not to exclude families based on personal prejudices. I never excluded anyone based on. We have the documentation, Margaret, Jennifer interrupted, and the pool incident was recorded. It's already circulating online. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Online? Sophia Washington stood up, her posture impeccable in her tailored suit. Ms. Whitman, I spent the weekend consulting with my colleagues. Your actions potentially violate several anti-discrimination statutes. However, we're not interested in legal battles. We moved here for community, not conflict. What do you want? Margaret whispered, suddenly aware of how quickly her world was unraveling. Accountability, Darius answered simply. And change. The board voted unanimously to remove Margaret as president pending a community-wide election the following month. As an interim measure, she was required to complete a diversity and inclusion training program and perform community service hours with the Neighborhood Beautification Committee. Margaret stumbled to her car after the meeting, ignoring the stares of her neighbors. Her phone buzzed with a notification. A friend request from Sophia Washington, accompanied by a message. When you're ready to talk, I'm willing to listen. Margaret deleted the notification and drove home in silence, the evening's humiliation burning in her chest. This wasn't over. She would find a way to reclaim her position and vindicate herself. They would see that Sunnyside Estates needed her, whether they wanted to admit or not. 3 days after her public dethroning, Margaret stood in her kitchen, mapping out her comeback strategy on a whiteboard normally reserved for meal planning and social engagements. Her husband, Thomas, watched with growing concern from behind his coffee mug. Maggie, don't you think it's time to let this go? Maybe focus on something else for a while. Margaret spun around, marker still in hand. Let it go. 3 years of volunteer work, 3 years of keeping this neighborhood from descending into chaos, and you want me to let it go. Thomas sighed. You were removed from a volunteer position, not exiled from the country, and based on what I'm hearing. What you're hearing is one side of the story, Margaret snapped. Those emails were taken out of context. I was simply maintaining standards. By losing applications from certain families, Margaret slammed the marker down. You too. I expected support from my husband, at least. Thomas set his mug down and approached his wife, gently taking her hands. I support you, Maggie. That's why I'm suggesting we step back and think about what really matters here. Is this position worth all this stress? Worth damaging relationships with our neighbors? Margaret pulled away. This isn't about the position anymore. It's about clearing my name. I am not what they're making me out to be. Thomas hesitated. Then prove it. Not with schemes and strategies, but with actions. His words lingered in the air after he left for work. Margaret stared at her whiteboard, covered with plans to discredit board members and rally longtime residents to her cause. Was this really who she had become? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she spotted Mrs. Chen, her 80-year-old neighbor who had always been cordial but distant. I brought scones, Mrs. Chen said when Margaret opened the door. You always compliment mine at the block party, so I thought you might need some cheering up. Margaret accepted the basket, momentarily speechless. Thank you. That's very kind. Mrs. Chen nodded. I've lived here for 22 years, longer than anyone else in Sunnyside. I've seen 6 Asia presidents come and go. And I'm sure you've seen worse scandals than mine, Margaret attempted to joke. No, Mrs. Chen replied bluntly. I haven't, but I've seen people change. Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Chen continued. The beautification committee meets tomorrow at 9. They're replanting the entrance garden. Bring gloves and wear something you don't mind getting dirty. I don't think they want me there. Probably not. Come anyway. With that, Mrs. Chen turned and walked back to her house, leaving Margaret holding a basket of still warm scones and an implied challenge. That night, Margaret revised her plan. If clearing her name was the goal, perhaps Thomas and Mrs. Chen were right about the method. Instead of fighting the board's decision, she would embrace it, strategically, of course. Complete the required training with enthusiasm. Throw herself into community service. Become indispensable in new ways. And when the election came around next month, residents would remember her dedication, not her disgrace. She went to bed feeling better than she had in days. This was a temporary setback, nothing more. Margaret Whitman didn't fail. She adapted. What she didn't anticipate was running into Sophia Washington at the garden the very next morning, both of them elbow-deep in mulch, with 6 hours of mandatory community service stretching before them. Margaret stared at Sophia Washington's outstretched hand, dirt smudged across her forearm. They had been working in silence for 45 excruciating minutes, pretending not to notice each other despite being assigned to the same section of the garden. Here, Margaret replied stiffly, passing the tool. Thank you. Sophia returned to planting salvia, her movements efficient and practiced. You garden often? Margaret couldn't help asking, annoyed by Sophia's apparent competence. My grandmother taught me. She believed working with your hands in soil was the best therapy. Sophia glanced up. Is this your first time gardening? The question stung with its accuracy. Margaret had always hired professionals for her immaculate front yard. I prefer to supervise rather than participate in landscape maintenance. Sophia laughed, a genuine sound that caught Margaret off guard. Well, today you're participating. There's something satisfying about it once you get past the dirt. I'm only here because I have to be, Margaret reminded her, determined to maintain her grievance. And I'm here because I volunteered. Life's full of ironies. Sophia sat back on her heels. Can I ask you something directly, Margaret? Margaret tensed. I suppose you've earned that right after orchestrating my public humiliation. I didn't orchestrate anything. You did that all by yourself. Sophia's voice remained frustratingly calm. What I want to know is why? Why go to such lengths to make my family feel unwelcome? The directness of the question caught Margaret unprepared. She'd expected accusations and not curiosity. I didn't. It wasn't personal, she stammered. Marking our applications with hold in DeFi feels pretty personal. Margaret jabbed her trowel into the soil. Sunnyside has standards. I've worked hard to maintain those standards. And you assume we wouldn't meet them? Based on what? Your modern furniture clashes with the neighborhood aesthetic. The basketball hoop in your driveway violates Section 3.4 of the Covenant. Your children are louder than the acceptable decibel level during quiet hours. Margaret rattled off her practiced justifications. Sophia set down her trowel. Those are the reasons you documented. I'm asking for the real reason. Their eyes locked across the freshly turned soil. Around them, other volunteers chatted amicably, their laughter creating a surreal backdrop to the tension between the two women. I don't like change, Margaret finally admitted, the truth surprising even herself. Sunnyside was perfect before the housing market exploded. Now there are new families with different ideas about what community means, different aesthetics, different values. Different skin colors? Sophia asked quietly. That's not. Margaret began automatically, then stopped. Was it? She never thought of herself that way, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The realization made her stomach twist uncomfortably. I don't know, she whispered. Maybe that's part of it. I've never had to think about it before. Sophia nodded slowly. That's probably the most honest thing you've said since we met. Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared with lemonade for the volunteers. How are our gardeners doing? Making progress with the plants and the conversation, I see. Some progress, Sophia confirmed, accepting a glass. Good, progress takes time. Mrs. Chen handed Margaret a glass. Just like gardens, you plant seeds, you nurture them, you wait. Sometimes what grows surprises you. As Mrs. Chen moved on to other volunteers, Margaret found herself standing beside Sophia, both of them dirty, sweaty, and somehow having taken the first fragile step toward understanding. I still think your basketball hoop violates the covenant, Margaret said after a moment. Sophia's lips twitched. I'm sure it does. My kids love it, though. Mine would have too, Margaret admitted softly. If I'd had any. Something shifted in Sophia's expression, but before she could respond, the garden coordinator called for everyone's attention, announcing lunch had arrived. The moment broke, but something had changed. As they walked toward the refreshment table, Margaret realized her carefully constructed plan for redemption had just become significantly more complicated. The diversity and inclusion training session was being held in the community center's main hall, a room Margaret had dominated countless times during HOA meetings. Now she sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching as Dr. Eliza Fernandez set up her presentation. Before we begin, Dr. Fernandez said, addressing the 30 participants, I want to clarify that this isn't about shaming or blaming. It's about awareness and growth. Margaret resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She was here because the board required it, not because she expected some magical transformation. Next to her sat Harold Bennett, the retired judge who had voted for her removal. Why are you even here? She whispered as Dr. Fernandez distributed handouts. Surely the moral paragon of Sunnyside doesn't need sensitivity training. Harold's weathered face crinkled with a smile. I'm always learning, Margaret. That's the secret to staying relevant past 70. Before she could reply, Dr. Fernandez launched into the session, asking participants to reflect on their earliest memories of recognizing difference. The room filled with murmured conversations as people turned to their partners. Harold turned expectantly to Margaret. Well, she sighed. 4th grade. A girl named Letitia joined her class mid-year. I remember thinking her braids were beautiful, but my mother told me not to mention them because it might make her uncomfortable about being different. Harold nodded. My father refused to hire a qualified black man at his hardware store in 1962. I was 15 and couldn't understand why. When I questioned him, he said, that's just how things are. That was the first time I realized adults could be wrong about important things. The simplicity of his story struck Margaret. And that's why you became a judge. Partly. I wanted to be in a position where "that's just how things are" wasn't an acceptable answer. Their conversation was interrupted as Dr. Fernandez called the group back together. The next exercise required examining scenarios involving implicit bias and discussing potential responses. Margaret found herself increasingly engaged, surprising even herself with thoughtful contributions. During the break, she approached Dr. Fernandez, the scenario about the neighborhood watch program that felt familiar. Dr. Fernandez nodded. It's based on real situations. Many people don't realize they're operating from bias until it's pointed out. How do you fix it? Once you realize, I mean. Awareness is the first step, then practice. New habits of thinking take time to develop, just like any skill. As Margaret returned to her seat, she noticed Sophia and Darius Washington had arrived and were chatting with several neighbors. The sight no longer filled her with indignation, but with a complicated mix of shame and curiosity. After the session, Margaret found herself lingering in the parking lot, unsure of what she was waiting for until Sophia emerged. I thought the basketball hoop was the problem, but it wasn't, Margaret blurted out as Sophia approached her car. Sophia stopped. What do you mean? I've been telling myself I was protecting Sunnyside's standards, but I think I was protecting something else. My idea of what this place should be. Who should belong here? And who decides that, Margaret? I thought I did, she admitted. I was wrong. Sophia studied her for a long moment. Have you had dinner yet? Darius makes an incredible pala, and we always have too much. The invitation caught Margaret completely off guard. You want me to come to your house for dinner? Consider it community service, Sophia said with a hint of a smile. For both of us. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. I'll follow you in my car. As she drove behind Sophia's SUV, Margaret tried to calm her racing thoughts. She was about to enter the home she had tried so hard to exclude from Sunnyside Estates. The irony wasn't lost on her, nor was the magnitude of the gesture Sophia was making. What she didn't realize was that this dinner would reveal secrets about Sunnyside that would shake her understanding of the community she thought she knew completely. The Washington home was nothing like Margaret had imagined. Instead of the ultra-modern, rule-bending decor she had envisioned, the interior was warm and traditional, with family photos lining the hallway and well-worn books filling built-in shelves. The supposed offensive basketball hoop visible from the dining room window was clearly the center of family life, judging by the children's artwork depicting family games displayed proudly on the refrigerator. Your home is lovely, Margaret admitted, accepting a glass of wine from Darius. Thank you. We tried to honor the character of the house while making it our own. Darius' professional demeanor had softened slightly, though wariness remained in his eyes. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, had been briefly introduced before being whisked upstairs by a teenage babysitter. They had regarded Margaret with undisguised curiosity, clearly aware of who she was. Dad says you're the lady from the pool, the youngest boy had said before being gently shushed. Now seated at their dining table with fragrant palace steaming between them, Margaret felt increasingly out of place. Not because she didn't belong, but because the narrative she had constructed about this family was disintegrating with every minute she spent in their home. I understand you were instrumental in getting the historical designation for Sunnyside, Darius commented as he served the food. Margaret looked up in surprise. Yes, it took nearly a year of paperwork and community meetings. It's one of the reasons we chose this neighborhood. We want to preserve a piece of history while creating our own. The conversation progressed with surprising ease, touching on neighborhood initiatives, the children's schools, and eventually circling back to the Akoa situation. I've been researching Sunnyside's history for a community project, Sophia said, refilling Margaret's glass. Did you know there were restrictive covenants written into the original deeds in the 1940s? Margaret frowned. Restrictive how? They prohibited selling homes to non-white families. Legally unenforceable now, of course, but they weren't formally removed from the paperwork until 1976. Sophia retrieved a folder from a nearby desk. I found copies in the county records. Interestingly, they were almost identical to the community standards section of your revised HOA guidelines from last year. Margaret's hand froze midway to her wine glass. That's impossible. I drafted those guidelines myself. Based on what source material? Darius asked quietly. Margaret thought back to the process. I found an old binder in the clubhouse storage room. Previous HOA documents going back decades. I modernized the language but kept the essential standards. Sophia laid out photocopied pages side by side, the original deed restrictions and Margaret's updated guidelines. The similarities were unmistakable, despite the updated terminology. I had no idea, Margaret whispered, genuine horror washing over her. I thought I was preserving neighborhood character, not this. Most people don't recognize coded language unless they've been excluded by it, Sophia explained gently. That's why diversity in decision-making is so important. We're not villainizing you, Margaret, Darius added. Systems perpetuate themselves unless actively dismantled. You inherited these ideas without questioning their origins. Margaret pushed her plate away, appetite gone. But I should have questioned them. That's the point, isn't it? Yes, Sophia agreed simply. But recognition is the first step toward change. As the conversation continued, Margaret learned more about Sunnyside's complicated history and about the Washingtons. Darius had grown up in a neighborhood similar to Sunnyside, but had been one of only 3 black families allowed to purchase homes there. Sophia had experienced housing discrimination firsthand when searching for her first apartment after law school. "Why are you telling me all this?" Margaret finally asked. "After what I did, why invite me into your home?" Sophia exchanged a glance with Darius before answering. "Because isolation reinforces prejudice. Connection challenges it." And Darius added, "Because we want to be good neighbors, even when it's difficult." As Margaret drove home later that evening, her mind raced with revelations. The HOA guidelines she had so proudly enforced were built on a foundation of exclusion she had never recognized. The family she had tried to keep out had shown her more grace than she deserved. What would she do with this knowledge? The HOA election was 3 weeks away, and Margaret Whitman, for the first time in her life, was uncertain about her next move. The neighborhood bulletin board outside the Sunnyside Estates clubhouse had always been Margaret's domain. She had personally approved every flyer, monitored every announcement, and maintained what she had called informational integrity with ruthless efficiency. Today, she stood before it with a stapler in one hand and a stack of flyers in the other, hesitating. Community FORUM. Examining CUNY's IDs past, building CUNY's IDs future. Speaker, Dr. Eliza Fernandez. Panel, Historical Society representatives and current residents. Saturday, 2 p.m., Community Center. Margaret had drafted the flyer herself, consulting with Sophia on the wording and with Harold on the logistics. Now, as she prepared to post it publicly, she questioned her decision for the 100th time. "Need help with that?" Margaret turned to find Jennifer Rodriguez watching her with undisguised curiosity. "I've got it, thank you," Margaret replied, finally stapling the flyer to the board. Jennifer read it silently, her eyebrows rising. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Margaret smoothed the paper carefully. "After the training sessions and my community service hours, I thought this was the logical next step. Margaret Whitman hosting a forum on Sunnyside's history of exclusionary practices. Yes, that's unexpected." Jennifer's tone softened, but not unwelcome. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" The question hit at Margaret's core insecurity. Was she ready to stand before her neighbors, many of whom still regarded her with suspicion, and acknowledged the harm caused by policies she had championed? Was she prepared for the potential backlash from longtime residents who, like her former self, preferred not to examine the foundations of their community too closely? "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but it needs to be done, whether I'm ready or not." Jennifer nodded slowly. "I'll help spread the word." As Jennifer walked away, Margaret felt the weight of her decision settle more firmly on her shoulders. In the 3 weeks since dinner at the Washingtons, she had immersed herself in Sunnyside's history, uncovering uncomfortable truths about the community she thought she knew completely. The neighborhood had been founded with explicitly discriminatory covenants. The winding streets and limited entrances weren't just charming design elements. They were intended to control access and visibility. Even the neighborhood's name, Sunnyside Estates, had been chosen specifically to evoke exclusivity. Margaret had presented her findings to the HOA board in a private meeting, recommending a complete overhaul of the guidelines. To her surprise, they had unanimously supported the initiative, with Harold Bennett volunteering to chair the revision committee. "You're running out of community service hours to complete," he had noted with a smile. "But I suspect you'll stay involved anyway." He was right. Margaret had withdrawn her candidacy for the upcoming HOA election, endorsing a diverse slate of candidates instead. Her energy was now directed toward the community forum and the guideline revisions, work that felt more meaningful than any citation she had ever issued for unapproved mailbox colors. The day of the forum arrived with unexpected sunshine after a week of rain. Margaret arrived early to arrange chairs, her stomach knotted with anxiety. Dr. Fernandez had agreed to moderate the discussion, providing historical context before opening the floor to resident experiences. People began filtering in 30 minutes before the scheduled start. Margaret recognized faces she had cited for violations, neighbors she had excluded from committees, and new residents she had subtly discouraged from community involvement. She greeted each one personally, ignoring the whispers that followed her through the room. The Washingtons arrived with their children and Mrs. Chen in tow. Sophia gave Margaret an encouraging nod as they found seats in the front row. When the room reached capacity with additional neighbors standing along the walls, Dr. Fernandez called for attention. Margaret stepped to the podium, her prepared notes trembling slightly in her hands. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. Today isn't about assigning blame or dwelling in guilt. It's about understanding our community's history so we can consciously shape its future. As Margaret introduced Dr. Fernandez and outlined the purpose of the forum, she caught Sophia's eye. The slight smile she received gave her the courage to continue with what came next. Before we begin the formal presentation, I want to acknowledge my own role in perpetuating systems of exclusion in Sunnyside. As your former HOA president, I enforced guidelines without questioning their origins or impacts. I made decisions based on maintaining what I perceived as community standards without considering who those standards excluded. A hushed silence fell over the room. I was wrong, Margaret stated clearly, and I am committed to doing better, not just personally, but in ensuring our community structures do better as well. The applause that followed was scattered at first, then grew. It wasn't universal. Margaret noted several longtime residents exchanging disapproving glances, but it was genuine. As she took her seat and Dr. Fernandez began her presentation, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The need for control that had driven her HOA presidency was being replaced by something else, a desire for connection, for genuine community. The forum continued for over 3 hours, with residents sharing stories that had never been voiced publicly in Sunnyside before. By the time it concluded, Margaret knew the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the pool incident, as it had come to be known in Sunnyside Estates lore, Margaret stood at the edge of that same pool, watching families of various backgrounds enjoying the newly renovated facility. Children splashed in the water while parents chatted in groups beneath umbrella-shaded tables, the scene in marked contrast to the segregated gatherings of previous summers. Quite a change, isn't it? Harold Bennett approached, leaning on his cane. At 74, he had finally stepped back from HOA leadership, though he remained an active advisor to the new board. For the better, Margaret replied, meaning it. The transformation of Sunnyside over the past months had been nothing short of remarkable. The revised HOA guidelines had been approved by an overwhelming majority of residents. The community calendar now featured cultural celebrations and educational events alongside the traditional block parties and garden tours. Even the neighborhood newsletter, once Margaret's vehicle for announcing violations, now highlighted diverse resident achievements and community initiatives. Have you seen the latest property valuations? Harold asked. Up 15% since last quarter. Turns out inclusivity is good for real estate too. Margaret smiled. Don't tell that to the Williams family. They're still threatening to move if we allow the Paddles to build that pergola. Some people resist change until the end, Harold shrugged. But they're the minority now. As if on cue, Sophia Washington appeared at the pool gate, waving to both of them. Behind her followed the planning committee for Sunnyside's first Cultural Heritage Festival, scheduled for the following month. Meeting in 5 minutes, Sophia called. We need your input on the vendor layout, Margaret. Margaret nodded, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that had replaced her former need for control. Her role in the community had evolved from enforcer to facilitator, from gatekeeper to bridge builder. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been resistance, backsliding, moments of doubt, but it had been genuine. Go ahead, Harold encouraged. I'll join you shortly. As Margaret gathered her things, she spotted Darius Washington teaching a group of children to dive at the deep end of the pool. Among them was Thomas Whitman Jr., her nephew who had recently come to live with Margaret and Thomas after his parents' divorce. The boy had been withdrawn upon arrival, but Sunnyside's new atmosphere had helped him flourish. Aunt Margaret, he called, waving excitedly. Dr. Washington says I have natural form. That's wonderful, TJ, she called back, her heart warming at the simple interaction, one that wouldn't have been possible under her previous reign. The planning meeting proceeded efficiently, with Margaret contributing logistical expertise without attempting to dominate the decision-making. As discussions concluded, Sophia pulled her aside. There's something I need to tell you, Sophia said, her expression serious. The Williams family has been circulating a petition to reinstate the old HOA guidelines. They're claiming the neighborhood is losing its character and property values will plummet. Margaret felt a chill despite the summer heat. How many signatures? 17 so far, mostly old guard residents who've been here since the beginning. Not enough to force a vote, but enough to create division. Sophia nodded. They're specifically targeting your involvement in the cultural festival, suggesting you've been manipulated. The implication stung, but Margaret had developed thicker skin over the months. What do you suggest? That's just it. We want your input. You understand their perspective better than anyone else on the committee. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. 6 months ago, she would have been the one circulating such a petition. Now she was being asked to help counter it. I'll speak with them, she decided. Not to debate or persuade, but to listen. Sometimes resistance comes from feeling unheard. Sophia squeezed her arm. That's why you're invaluable to this community, Margaret. You bridge worlds that don't always understand each other. As Margaret drove home that evening, she reflected on Sophie's words. She had once viewed Sunnyside Estates as her domain to protect and control. Now she understood it as a living community, constantly evolving through the contributions of all its members. The Williams family's petition was a reminder that transformation of communities and individuals was rarely linear or complete. There would always be resistance, regression, and the temptation to retreat to comfortable biases. Margaret pulled into her driveway, noticing Mrs. Chen tending her front garden across the street. The elderly woman waved, and Margaret walked over to join her, kneeling carefully beside the flower bed. "How are the roses coming along?" Mrs. Chen asked, referencing the bushes she had helped Margaret plant in the spring. "Blooming beautifully," Margaret replied, "though I'm still learning to prune them properly." Mrs. Chen nodded sagely. "Pruning is the hardest part. Cut too little and the plant becomes overcrowded. Cut too much and you lose this year's flowers. But get it right," she gestured to her own magnificent roses. The results speak for themselves. As they continued gardening in companionable silence, Margaret considered Mrs. Chen's metaphor. Her own transformation had required significant pruning of assumptions, prejudices, and the need for control. The process had been painful at times, but necessary for new growth. The Williams family's petition represented the ongoing nature of that process, and not just for Margaret, but for Sunnyside as a whole. The work of creating genuine community would never be fully complete. There would always be new challenges, new biases to confront, new balances to strike.